They laughed when I signed the deed to Grandpa's old bee farm. An office girl raising bees? My mother scoffed, while my father told me to get back to a real job. A year later, they sat across from me in a glass boardroom, begging for a place in the very project they ridiculed. What they didn't know was this all started when my boss stole my idea, and a swarm of bees taught me about revenge. My name is Marin Vale, and at 32, I was a ghost who hadn't died yet. I was a senior supply chain analyst for Norval & Co., a title that sounded important, but really meant I spent 10 hours a day staring at spreadsheets in a glass box on the 27th floor in Midtown Ridge. From my window, I could see the entire city bleed into the suburbs, a sprawling, inefficient organism of concrete and steel. I didn't see buildings. I saw distribution hubs, traffic choke points, and last-mile delivery failures. My job was to make the synthetic heart of Norval's processed food empire beat a little smoother, a little cheaper. I was good at it because I saw patterns where others saw chaos. The air in the pre-pitch conference room was thick with the signature Norval scent, industrial-strength carpet cleaner, burnt coffee, and the cloying sweetness of the fruit-flavored corn syrup that was our company's lifeblood. It was the smell of ambition and slow decay. I stood before my direct superior, Grant Oster, my laptop open to the presentation I had spent the last 6 months of my life creating. It was titled The Urban Pollination Loop. Grant, a man whose ambition was only matched by the cheap gleam of his polyester blend suit, nodded slowly. He had a way of listening that wasn't about hearing. It was about calculating. His eyes, small and perpetually assessing, scanned my first slide. Urban pollination loop, he murmured, tasting the words. Catchy. It's more than catchy. Grant, it's a paradigm shift, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I had rehearsed this in my tiny apartment until the words felt like my own skin. We're bleeding money on price-volatile sweeteners and synthetic flavor enhancers for our cereal and candy lines. Meanwhile, the domestic honey market is fragmented, unreliable. We see small apiaries as a liability, but they're an untapped asset. This proposal outlines a partnership program. We subsidize small, local bee farms within our existing distribution corridors. In return, we get first option purchasing rights on their honey and pollen at a stabilized, pre-negotiated rate. We reduce our reliance on volatile commodities. We cut logistics costs by sourcing hyperlocally, and the marketing department gets to plaster sustainably sourced over everything. It's a closed-loop system that saves millions and generates incredible PR. I clicked through the slides, my voice gaining confidence. I showed him the data models, the projected cost savings of 12% in the first fiscal year, the heat maps of apiaries clustered around our weakest supply points. I had poured everything into this. It was elegant, efficient, and it was mine. Grant leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The gesture was meant to look thoughtful, but it was pure appropriation. He was already seeing his own face in the company newsletter. "This is solid, Marin, really solid," he said, the praise feeling like a precursor to a theft. "But the board, they're old school. They need a little more punch, a little more executive confidence," he smiled, a thin predatory slash. "Tell you what, send me the deck. Let me tweak the slides for you. Punch up the language before the big pitch this afternoon. I'll make sure it sings." A cold knot formed in my stomach. The phrase "help you" in the corporate world is almost always a threat. It means, give me your work so I can take credit for it. But what choice did I have? He was my boss. Refusing would be seen as insubordination, and my name was already on the rumored shortlist for the next round of synergistic restructuring, layoffs. "Of course, Grant," I said, the words tasting like ash. "I'll email it over right now." I hit send, and in that moment, I felt the project slip through my fingers like fine dust. I watched him open the file, his face illuminated by the glow of my meticulously crafted graphs. He was already changing the file name. 3 hours later, I was standing at the back of the main boardroom, a cavern of mahogany and smoked glass reserved for the company's upper echelon. The air was chilled to a precise 68 degrees, a temperature designed to keep aging men in expensive suits from falling asleep. I wasn't invited to sit at the table. Grant had told me my presence was required for potential follow-up questions, which meant I was to stand there as living set dressing, a silent testament to the hard work his team had put in. The lights dimmed. Grant stood at the podium, his posture radiating a confidence he hadn't earned. The first slide flashed onto the massive screen, and the air left my lungs. The title was no longer The Urban Pollination Loop. Now, in a bold, aggressive font, it read, The B-Track Initiative, an Oster Innovation. My name was gone, wiped clean. Every slide, every data point, every carefully worded projection was still there, but my intellectual DNA had been scrubbed from the scene of the crime. He was presenting my soul, and he hadn't even bothered to change the color scheme. I stood frozen, a ghost at my own funeral. My mind flashed back to a dozen other meetings, a dozen other small ideas I'd floated that were mysteriously absorbed into Grant's talking points a week later. I had been a fool. I wasn't a valued analyst. I was his personal think tank, a resource to be mined and then discarded. The rumors of layoffs suddenly felt less like a rumor and more like a prophecy. Why keep the quarry when you've already stripped it bare? As Grant's voice droned on, weaving my research into a narrative of his own genius, my phone buzzed silently in my pocket. I slipped it out, keeping it below the level of the table. A text from Talia, my only real friend in this viper pit. She sat 3 seats down from the CEO, a junior marketing associate who saw everything. The message was 2 words: save everything. Her warning sliced through my shock, sharpening it into cold, clear rage. My gaze lifted from the phone and scanned the room. The executives were captivated. They were nodding, sipping their ice water, completely buying the performance. Grant was a master salesman, and today's product was me. Then, through the frosted glass wall of a smaller, adjacent meeting room, I saw him. A Norval VP was shaking hands with a man I recognized from industry reports, the CEO of Dryline Sugars. Dryline was a name synonymous with scandal, a company that had been sued multiple times in the last decade for adulterating their high-fructose corn syrup with undeclared, cheaper fillers. They were the epitome of everything my project was designed to move us away from. And as I watched, Grant, mid-sentence about corporate responsibility, glanced toward the glass, caught the VP's eye, and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The VP then initialed a document, an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, a preliminary deal. It all clicked into place. Grant wasn't just stealing my idea, he was gutting it. He would use the B-Track name as a PR shield, a greenwashed facade to distract from the fact that he was simultaneously locking in a deal with one of the dirtiest suppliers in the industry. He would leverage my work on sustainability to provide cover for his own dirty cost-cutting scheme. He wasn't just a thief, he was a parasite. My blood ran cold. I didn't storm into the room. I didn't shout. An emotional outburst would only get me fired and escorted out by security. They would call me hysterical, unstable. No, revenge, I realized in that instant, was not a dish best served cold. It was a dish best served with data, documentation, and a lawyer. While Grant basked in the applause, I slipped out of the boardroom, back at my desk in the open-plan bullpen. The fluorescent lights hummed with an almost violent intensity. My hands were perfectly steady. I didn't make a scene. I worked. First, I opened my sent items. I took a clear photo with my phone of the email I sent to Grant, the one with my original presentation attached, its timestamp a digital fingerprint of creation. 10:17 a.m. I took another photo of the file properties, clearly showing my name as the author. Then, I dug deeper. On the shared company drive, I found the modified version Grant was presenting. Its properties showed Grant Oster as the author, but the metadata doesn't lie. The last modified time was 10:24 a.m., just 7 minutes after I had sent him my file. Not enough time to create a 30-page deck, but just enough time to do a find and replace on a name and change a title. I screenshotted everything. I logged into my email archive, searching for every communication I'd ever had with Grant about the project, the early brainstorming notes, the progress reports, his dismissive replies. I forwarded the entire chain to my personal email address. The subject line a simple, innocuous, FWD, project notes. Finally, I took out the small, personal USB drive I kept on my keychain. It was disguised as a honeycomb-shaped trinket. I plugged it in, the small device feeling impossibly heavy in the sterile silence of the office. I dragged my original presentation, all my research files, the screenshots, the metadata logs, everything. I created a folder, named it Insurance, and copied it all. Then I ejected the drive, dropped it into my pocket, and shut down my computer. I had become the ghost they wanted me to be, silently collecting evidence of my own murder. The train ride home to Fox Hollow that evening was a blur of motion and stark clarity. The gleaming towers of Midtown Ridge gave way to the cookie-cutter suburbs, then finally to the dark, rolling hills of the countryside. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track was a metronome counting down the seconds of my old life. I didn't feel despair. I felt a strange, liberating calm. I had been pushed out of a world I was never truly a part of. I reached into my bag and pulled out, not my phone or a laptop, but a worn, leather-bound journal. It was my grandfather's. When he died 2 years ago, it was the only thing I had truly wanted. It smelled of beeswax, pipe tobacco, and damp earth. Inside, spanning nearly 30 years, was his life's work, not in words, but in data, page after page of meticulous, hand-drawn maps of his bee colony's migratory patterns, cross-referenced with decades of bloom calendars for every wildflower, clover field, and fruit orchard in a 50-mile radius. To my parents, it was the eccentric ramblings of an old man who preferred bees to people. To me, it was the most elegant supply chain diagram I had ever seen. I flipped it open, the brittle pages whispering under my touch. My finger traced one of his maps, a route his bees took every July, a winding path from the lavender fields near the old quarry to the wild sagebrush on Miller's Ridge. I pulled out my phone, opening up one of my Norval logistics maps I had saved for offline viewing. I held the phone over the notebook, comparing the two. And then I saw it. My breath caught in my chest. The route my grandfather's bees had flown for 30 years, the one they had perfected through generations of instinct and collective intelligence, perfectly mirrored a massive logistical blind spot for Norval. It was a corridor between 3 of our major distribution arteries, an area our routing software always flagged as inefficient due to unpredictable road closures and terrain. We spent millions a year trying to brute force our way through it. But the bees knew the secret. They followed the bloom, a path dictated not by asphalt and traffic lights, but by the rhythm of the earth. Their flight path was a map to a more efficient, more natural, and more powerful network than anything Norval's algorithms could ever devise. A slow smile spread across my face. Grant had stolen my idea, but he had only taken the hollow corporate shell of it. He had no idea where the real power was. He thought he was playing with spreadsheets and buzzwords. I was holding the source code, on that train, suspended between the dying world of the city and the living world of the countryside. I understood. The bees hadn't just taught my grandfather about honey. They had taught him about systems, about networks, and about survival. And now, they were about to teach me how to sting. The train rattled on, a metal serpent sliding through the dark. But I was no longer inside it. I was floating somewhere above the landscape, seeing the world as a complex, interconnected map. The faded ink of my grandfather's journal and the cold, hard data from Norval's servers had merged in my mind, creating a new and startlingly clear picture. The pollen routes were a perfect, elegant solution to a logistical bottleneck that had cost the company millions, a secret whispered by bees, a secret I now held. The weight of the journal in my lap felt less like a memory and more like a weapon. A profound sense of power, cold and clean, washed over me. and with it came the bitter taste of every laugh, every dismissive glance I had endured for choosing this path. My parents, Harold and Denise Vale, lived in Lakesend, a town built on the bedrock of quiet judgment and impeccably manicured lawns. Their world was one of secure salaries, company health insurance, and 401ks. My grandfather's farm, just a few towns over in the wilder, scruffier Fox Hollow, was an affront to their orderly existence. They hated what they called its wild smell, a blend of damp earth, clover, and the faint, sweet perfume of beeswax. To them, it was the smell of failure, of a life lived outside the safe confines of a corporate ladder. The memory of the day the will was read came back to me, as sharp and unwelcome as a hornet's sting. We were gathered in a stuffy lawyer's office downtown. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and my mother's funereal perfume. My father kept checking his watch, as if grief had a deadline. My cousin, Kyle, was there too, looking like a vulture in a poorly fitting suit, his eyes gleaming with an unseemly hunger. He had always seen my grandfather's land as a future subdivision. The lawyer, a man with a face like worn leather, cleared his throat. To his son, Harold, and daughter-in-law, Denise, he read, Arthur Vale leaves the sum of $100,000. My parents exchanged a look of mild, respectable satisfaction. It was a neat, tidy sum. It could be invested. It made sense. To his grandson, Kyle, the lawyer continued, he leaves the sum of $50,000. Kyle gave a tight, greedy little smile. And to his granddaughter, Marin, the lawyer paused, peering at me over his spectacles. Arthur leaves a choice. You may have the remaining cash assets, valued at approximately $120,000, or you may have the deed to the Fox Hollow property, its structures, and all attendant equipment. A heavy silence filled the room. To my family, this wasn't a choice. It was a test of sanity. Cash, clean and digital, versus 2 acres of unruly land, a drafty barn, a collapsing cottage, and a few million buzzing insects. My mother leaned forward, her voice a tense whisper. Marin, honey, take the money. Kyle smirked. Yeah, Mar, what are you going to do with a bunch of bugs? But I was thinking of my grandfather's hands, calloused and stained with propolis, gently holding a frame swarming with life. I was thinking of the quiet hum of the hives on a summer afternoon, a sound more peaceful than any silence. I'll take the farm, I said. The sound that erupted from my parents wasn't just a gasp, it was a laugh, a sharp, incredulous bark of ridicule. Don't be absurd, my father said, his face flushing. You're a supply chain analyst. For God's sake, what do you know about farming? An accountant playing farmer? My mother's voice was laced with a unique blend of pity and scorn. Marin, be serious. This is your future. Kyle leaned across the mahogany table, his whisper slick with false concern. Listen to them, he hissed. Take the cash. If you really want the land, I'll buy it off you. Give you a good price. Keep it in the family. You can still walk away with something. He wasn't offering to help. He was offering to profit from my perceived stupidity. I looked from his predatory face to my parents' disappointed one. They saw a liability. I saw a legacy. No, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I'm keeping it. That night, back at their sterile home in Lakesend for a tense, obligatory dinner, the assault continued. The train car's gentle rocking couldn't shake the memory of my mother's anger. She had cornered me in the kitchen, her face a mask of frustration. You need stability. Marin, a career. Norval gives you a salary, benefits, a pension. The bees give you nothing but stings and bills. She slammed a cabinet door, the sound echoing the finality of her judgment. You're throwing your life away on a whim, on some romantic notion about your grandfather. He was a lonely old man. Is that what you want? I didn't answer. Instead, my mind retreated to a warmer memory. Me, age 12, sitting on an upturned bucket in the honey shed. My grandfather's hand, already trembling slightly with the onset of age, was writing in his journal. I had asked him why he never sold the farm to developers, why he worked so hard for so little money. He had stopped writing, looked at me with his pale, clear eyes, and tapped the journal. Then he wrote a single sentence on a scrap of paper and pushed it towards me. "Don't let the bees fall into greedy hands." His hands, I now realized, weren't just trembling from age, they were trembling with conviction. At the dinner table, my father launched into his favorite topic, other people's failures. "Heard the Jensens are selling their dairy farm," he announced to the table, carving a roast with surgical precision. "Couldn't keep up. The big conglomerates squeezed them out. Sad story." My mother sighed dramatically, and poor Martha from the garden center had to declare bankruptcy, tried to make a go with organic vegetables. You just can't compete. Not really. Every word was a projectile aimed at me. They were building a narrative, a cautionary tale with me as the foolish protagonist destined for ruin. Kyle, ever the helpful narrator, chimed in. "It's all about scale, Uncle Harold. You go big or you go broke. A little hobby farm? That's a money pit, not a business." I sat in silence, pushing a green bean around my plate. Then, without a word, I stood up, went to my bag, and retrieved a small, unlabeled glass jar. I brought it back to the table and opened it. Inside was the last batch of honey my grandfather had ever harvested. It was a deep, impossible shade of amber, so dark it was almost mahogany. I tilted the jar, and a thick, slow ribbon of honey flowed onto my side plate. It didn't run. It coiled, capturing the light from the dining room chandelier and holding it like a trapped star. The scent rose to meet me, not just sweet, but complex and wild. Notes of clover, lavender, and something earthy and dark, like the forest floor after a rain. It was the smell of a landscape, a season, a life's work, all held within that viscous, golden drop. My mother glanced at it. "Oh, that's pretty," she said, her tone the same one she used for a child's finger painting. She turned back to my father. "So, did the Jensens get a good price for their cattle?" "Just looks nice," Kyle added, not even bothering to look. "Probably loaded with sugar anyway." They didn't ask to taste it. They didn't ask what flowers it came from. They didn't see the 30 years of knowledge, the symbiotic dance between man and insect, the pure, unadulterated essence of a place. They just saw a quaint, brown liquid on a plate, a footnote in their conversation about failure. Their laughter continued, echoing in the polished dining room as they moved on to discuss the stock market. I picked up the jar and screwed the lid back on, the metal scraping against the glass. The motion was deliberate, final. I was putting a secret away. I was hiding a treasure in plain sight. They could have the world they understood, the world of spreadsheets and stock tickers and corporate insurance. I would keep the one they couldn't see. The train's horn blew, a low, mournful sound that pulled me from the memory. We were pulling into the small station at Fox Hollow. The platform was empty, lit by a single, buzzing fluorescent light. I stepped out of the train car, and the air was instantly different. The chill of the autumn night was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke, the air of my other life. I shouldered my bag and began the short walk to the farm. The moon was high and bright, illuminating the path. As I rounded the final bend, I saw it. The property was dark, the cottage and barn just hulking shapes against the starry sky. But in the overgrown meadow that bordered the lane, there was movement, a low, gentle hum that was more felt than heard. Even in the cool of the evening, a few determined bees were still at work, flitting among the last of the wild asters. They moved with a purpose that was both ancient and immediate, their small bodies dusted with the gold of pollen. They weren't just gathering food. They were communicating, collaborating, updating a map that had existed long before Norval's servers ever whirred to life. They were dancing out the directions to a future my family could never imagine. A future built not on stability, but on resilience. A future they had laughed at. And as I stood there, watching them, I knew they were drawing a new map for me, too. It was a map of revenge, and its roads were paved with honey. The first week was a blur of aching muscles and the metallic tang of rust. The sign at the entrance, weathered and tilting, read, Vale Apiary. I took it down with a crowbar, the rotted wood splintering in my hands. This wasn't just my grandfather's legacy anymore. It was my declaration of war. In its place, I hung a new sign, carved from a solid piece of oak and branded with a soldering iron. Fox Hollow Hiveworks. It sounded solid, deliberate, a fusion of the pastoral and the industrial. It sounded like me. The old honey shed, which was more of a barn, became my headquarters. Its wood was the color of faded grief. I spent 3 days on a ladder scraping away the old, peeling paint, uncovering the strong cedar beneath. The rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape was a form of meditation, erasing the memory of keyboard clicks and fluorescent lights. I repainted it a deep, earthy red, the color of late autumn sumac. I patched the roof, replacing warped frames of wood, my hands learning the language of hammers and nails. The work was brutal and honest, and every evening I collapsed into my grandfather's lumpy armchair, exhausted and more satisfied than I'd ever been in my life. This wasn't just a restoration, it was an upgrade. My analytical mind, starved for a real-world problem, went to work. I ordered a dozen cheap temperature and humidity sensors online, the kind hobbyists use for homebrewing. I spent an evening at the small kitchen table, soldering wires to tiny Arduino boards, my movements precise and focused. The next day, I suited up and gently installed a sensor inside the wall of each hive. I wasn't just going to keep bees. I was going to listen to them. I was going to translate their ancient, humming language into data. It was during the great clean-out of the barn that I found the treasure. Tucked away under a pile of burlap sacks in the darkest corner was a heavy tin chest, dented and sealed with rust. I pried it open, and the air filled with the scent of old paper and time. Inside, perfectly preserved, were my grandfather's business ledgers. They weren't just lists of sales. They were a history of the community's palate. Page after page of his elegant, looping script detailed orders from the past 40 years. 3 gallons, wildflower, for the North Creek Bakery. 12 jars, orange blossom, Mrs. Gable's daughter's wedding. 1 frame, honeycomb, for the chef at the Old Mill Inn. Many of the names were of businesses that were now just ghost stories, local legends swallowed by big box stores. Driven by a sudden impulse, I took the oldest ledger, from 1985, and started making calls. The first number was disconnected. The second was now a laundromat. But the third one, for a Henderson's Fine Breads, was answered by a gruff, elderly man. "Yeah, what is it?" "Hello?" I said, my voice uncertain. "I'm calling about an old account with Vale Apiary. My grandfather, Arthur Vale." There was a long silence on the other end. "Artie?" The man's voice rasped, suddenly softer. "My God, Artie Vale. He made the best damn clover honey this side of the state. I'm long retired, miss, but you tell whoever's taken over that Henderson's hasn't had a decent honey wheat loaf since Artie stopped delivering." Another call, to a number listed next to a Mrs. Gable, was answered by a woman who, when I mentioned the orange blossom honey for her wedding, simply broke down and cried. "Your grandfather was such a kind man," she sobbed. "He brought the honey himself. He told me it was a sweet start for a sweet life." I hung up the phone each time with a growing sense of awe. My grandfather hadn't just been selling a product. He had been building a community, 1 jar of honey at a time. He had been weaving himself into the fabric of people's lives. That Saturday, Talia drove out from the city. She arrived in her sensible sedan, looking completely out of place in her chic city clothes against the backdrop of my wild, unruly farm. She stepped out of the car, took a deep breath of the country air, and a slow smile spread across her face. "It smells like freedom," she said, "and manure." "That's the smell of opportunity," I laughed. She had quit Norval the day after I did, refusing, as she put it, to work for a soulless content thief. She was my first and only investor, putting a small chunk of her savings into what she called the Furious Bee Revenge Fund. That afternoon, we became alchemists. I brought out a dozen small jars of honey from my grandfather's last few harvests, each from a different hive and a different season. In his journal, he hadn't just recorded data, he'd written what he called flavor notes, describing the honey's character as if it were music. Clover, a bright, clean soprano. Wild apple blossom, a shy fleeting harmony. Black sage, a deep, resonant bass note. We sat on the porch with an array of tiny spoons, tasting and blending, trying to recreate his symphonies. We mixed the bright soprano of clover with the earthy bass of sage, creating a complex, layered flavor that was unlike anything I'd ever tasted from a store. We were not just mixing honey, we were curating an experience. My nights were spent back in a world I understood, the digital one. But this time, it felt different. I ran a cable from the cottage to the honey shed, turning it into my command center. There, surrounded by the sweet smell of beeswax, I wrote a few simple lines of code. I built a crude but effective API, a digital bridge that connected the sensors in my hives to a Google Sheet. Every 15 minutes, they would upload a new data point: temperature, humidity, and even acoustic vibrations. The spreadsheet slowly filled with life, a digital pulse of the colony. I built a dashboard on top of it, translating the raw numbers into simple, elegant graphs. I could see the hive's activity spike in the mid-morning sun. I could see the internal temperature rise as they worked to keep the brood warm. I was creating a living, breathing data model of an entire ecosystem. By cross-referencing this data with my grandfather's bloom calendars, I could start to predict the peak of the nectar flow with astonishing accuracy. I knew, down to the day, when the black locust trees would blossom. Grant Oster had a team of analysts and a multi-million-dollar software suite. I had a dozen cheap sensors, a Google Sheet, and the collective wisdom of 1,000,000 bees. It wasn't a fair fight. With a product taking shape, I needed a brand. I designed a simple, handcrafted label on my laptop. It was minimalist and clean. Fox Hollow Hiveworks. And beneath it, single bloom honey. But the most important part was the space I left at the bottom, using a small, custom-made ink stamp. I began to label each jar not just with the type of honey, but with the specific date range of the bloom it came from. Wildflower, it would read. Bloom, July 12th and 18. This wasn't just honey. It was a snapshot of a single week in a single field. It was the antithesis of Norval's vague, meaningless marketing. It was radical transparency. I wasn't ready to face the world as Marin Vale. The failed analyst turned beekeeper, so I became a ghost online. I started an anonymous social media account under the Fox Hollow Hiveworks name. I posted no pictures of myself. The hero of the account was the data. I shared screenshots of the hive vibration graphs, the elegant sine waves of their daily hum. I posted short, mesmerizing videos of a queen walk, the mesmerizing sight of the queen bee gliding through a sea of her attendants. I posted macro photos of bees returning to the hive, their legs heavy with brightly colored pollen. It was quiet, nerdy, and deeply beautiful. I was sharing the secret life of the hive. And slowly, people started to listen. The first order came on a Tuesday morning, an email that made my heart leap into my throat. It wasn't from a distributor or a store. It was from a woman named Lena Petrov, the head of the culinary arts program at Graybridge Vocational College. Hello, the email read. I've been following your fascinating posts for the past month. The way you're documenting the hive's activity is remarkable. I am teaching a course on sensory tasting and the concept of terroir. Your single bloom honey, with its specific bloom date, is exactly what I've been looking for. Would it be possible to purchase 24 4-ounce jars of your most recent clover harvest for my class? 24 jars. It was a tiny order, almost laughable by Norval standards, but it was the most significant purchase order of my life. It was a validation from an expert, a sign that there were people out there who understood what I was trying to do. That night, I packed the jars myself, each one wrapped in tissue paper. a small, handwritten note included. As the seasons turned, I delved deeper into the craft, guided by the steady hand of my grandfather's journals. He had left behind not just data, but detailed instructions. I learned how to graft queens, the delicate, surgical act of transferring a single larva to create a new monarch. I learned how to read the moods of the hives, to know when to split a thriving colony to prevent a swarm. Following his precise, hand-drawn diagrams, I built wooden windbreaks at the edge of the property, protecting the hives from the harsh north wind he had warned about. I was no longer just the caretaker of his bees. I was becoming a beekeeper in my own right. My first winter was lean. The first harvest under the Fox Hollow Hiveworks name was small. I had only produced a few hundred jars, not enough to make a real profit, by any business metric I had been taught at Norval. My first year was a failure. The production volume was low, the margins were thin, and my market was microscopic. But one cool evening, as the sun set over the fields, I opened a jar from that first harvest. It was a batch of late-season goldenrod, a complex, almost spicy flavor. I took a small spoonful, closed my eyes, and tasted it. It was perfect. It was the taste of the sun, the soil, the rain, and the tireless work of thousands of my tiny, winged partners. The yield was low. Yes, but the flavor was irrefutable. It was pure, honest, and powerful, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it would be enough. The first week was a blur of aching muscles and the metallic tang of rust. The sign at the entrance, weathered and tilting, read, "Vale Apiary." I took it down with a crowbar, the rotted wood splintering in my hands. This wasn't just my grandfather's legacy anymore. It was my declaration of war. In its place, I hung a new sign, carved from a solid piece of oak and branded with a soldering iron, Fox Hollow Hiveworks. It sounded solid, deliberate, a fusion of the pastoral and the industrial. It sounded like me. The old honey shed, which was more of a barn, became my headquarters. Its wood was the color of faded grief. I spent 3 days on a ladder scraping away the old, peeling paint, uncovering the strong cedar beneath. The rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape was a form of meditation, erasing the memory of keyboard clicks and fluorescent lights. I repainted it a deep, earthy red, the color of late autumn sumac. I patched the roof, replacing warped frames of wood, my hands learning the language of hammers and nails. The work was brutal and honest, and every evening I collapsed into my grandfather's lumpy armchair, exhausted and more satisfied than I'd ever been in my life. This wasn't just a restoration, it was an upgrade. My analytical mind, starved for a real-world problem, went to work. I ordered a dozen cheap temperature and humidity sensors online, the kind hobbyists use for homebrewing. I spent an evening at the small kitchen table, soldering wires to tiny Arduino boards, my movements precise and focused. The next day, I suited up and gently installed a sensor inside the wall of each hive. I wasn't just going to keep bees. I was going to listen to them. I was going to translate their ancient humming language into data. It was during the great clean-out of the barn that I found the treasure. Tucked away under a pile of burlap sacks in the darkest corner was a heavy tin chest, dented and sealed with rust. I pried it open, and the air filled with the scent of old paper and time. Inside, perfectly preserved, were my grandfather's business ledgers. They weren't just lists of sales. They were a history of the community's palate. Page after page of his elegant, looping script detailed orders from the past 40 years. 3 gallons, wildflower, for the North Creek Bakery. 12 jars, orange blossom, Mrs. Gable's daughter's wedding. 1 frame, honeycomb, for the chef at the Old Mill Inn. Many of the names were of businesses that were now just ghost stories, local legends swallowed by big box stores. Driven by a sudden impulse, I took the oldest ledger, from 1985, and started making calls. The first number was disconnected. The second was now a laundromat. But the third one, for a Henderson's Fine Breads, was answered by a gruff, elderly man. "Yeah, What is it? Hello, I said, my voice uncertain. I'm calling about an old account with Vale Apiary, my grandfather, Arthur Vale. There was a long silence on the other end. Artie? The man's voice rasped, suddenly softer. My God. Artie Vale. He made the best damn clover honey this side of the state. I'm long retired, miss, but you tell whoever's taken over that Henderson's hasn't had a decent honey wheat loaf since Artie stopped delivering. Another call, to a number listed next to a Mrs. Gable, was answered by a woman who, when I mentioned the orange blossom honey for her wedding, simply broke down and cried. Your grandfather was such a kind man, she sobbed. He brought the honey himself. He told me it was a sweet start for a sweet life. I hung up the phone each time with a growing sense of awe. My grandfather hadn't just been selling a product. He had been building a community, one jar of honey at a time. He had been weaving himself into the fabric of people's lives. That Saturday, Talia drove out from the city. She arrived in her sensible sedan, looking completely out of place in her chic city clothes against the backdrop of my wild, unruly farm. She stepped out of the car, took a deep breath of the country air, and a slow smile spread across her face. It smells like freedom, she said, and manure. That's the smell of opportunity. I laughed. She had quit Norval the day after I did, refusing, as she put it, to work for a soulless content thief. She was my first and only investor, putting a small chunk of her savings into what she called the Furious Bee Revenge Fund. That afternoon, we became alchemists. I brought out a dozen small jars of honey from my grandfather's last few harvests, each from a different hive and a different season. In his journal, he hadn't just recorded data, he'd written what he called flavor notes, describing the honey's character as if it were music. Clover, a bright, clean soprano. Wild apple blossom, a shy, fleeting harmony. Black sage, a deep, resonant bass note. We sat on the porch with an array of tiny spoons, tasting and blending, trying to recreate his symphonies. We mixed the bright soprano of clover with the earthy bass of sage, creating a complex, layered flavor that was unlike anything I'd ever tasted from a store. We were not just mixing honey, we were curating an experience. My nights were spent back in a world I understood, the digital one. But this time, it felt different. I ran a cable from the cottage to the honey shed, turning it into my command center. There, surrounded by the sweet smell of beeswax. I wrote a few simple lines of code. I built a crude but effective API, a digital bridge that connected the sensors in my hives to a Google Sheet. Every 15 minutes, they would upload a new data point. Temperature, humidity, and even acoustic vibrations. The spreadsheet slowly filled with life, a digital pulse of the colony. I built a dashboard on top of it, translating the raw numbers into simple, elegant graphs. I could see the hive's activity spike in the mid-morning sun. I could see the internal temperature rise as they worked to keep the brood warm. I was creating a living, breathing data model of an entire ecosystem. By cross-referencing this data with my grandfather's bloom calendars, I could start to predict the peak of the nectar flow with astonishing accuracy. I knew, down to the day, when the black locust trees would blossom, Grant Oster had a team of analysts and a multi-million-dollar software suite. I had a dozen cheap sensors, a Google Sheet, and the collective wisdom of 1,000,000 bees. It wasn't a fair fight. With a product taking shape, I needed a brand. I designed a simple, handcrafted label on my laptop. It was minimalist and clean. Fox Hollow Hiveworks, and beneath it, Single Bloom Honey, but the most important part was the space I left at the bottom. Using a small, custom-made ink stamp, I began to label each jar not just with the type of honey, but with the specific date range of the bloom it came from. Wildflower, it would read. Bloom, July 12th to 18. This wasn't just honey. It was a snapshot of a single week in a single field. It was the antithesis of Norval's vague, meaningless marketing. It was radical transparency. I wasn't ready to face the world as Marin Vale. the failed analyst turned beekeeper, so I became a ghost online. I started an anonymous social media account under the Fox Hollow Hiveworks name. I posted no pictures of myself. The hero of the account was the data. I shared screenshots of the hive vibration graphs, the elegant sine waves of their daily hum. I posted short, mesmerizing videos of a queen walk, the mesmerizing sight of the queen bee gliding through a sea of her attendants. I posted macro photos of bees returning to the hive, their legs heavy with brightly colored pollen. It was quiet, nerdy, and deeply beautiful. I was sharing the secret life of the hive, and slowly, people started to listen. The first order came on a Tuesday morning, an email that made my heart leap into my throat. It wasn't from a distributor or a store. It was from a woman named Lena Petrov, the head of the culinary arts program at Graybridge Vocational College. "Hello," the email read. "I've been following your fascinating posts for the past month. The way you're documenting the hive's activity is remarkable. I am teaching a course on sensory tasting and the concept of terroir. Your single bloom honey, with its specific bloom date, is exactly what I've been looking for. Would it be possible to purchase 24 4-ounce jars of your most recent clover harvest for my class?" 24 jars. It was a tiny order, almost laughable by Norval standards, but it was the most significant purchase order of my life. It was a validation from an expert, a sign that there were people out there who understood what I was trying to do. That night, I packed the jars myself, each one wrapped in tissue paper, a small, handwritten note included. As the seasons turned, I delved deeper into the craft, guided by the steady hand of my grandfather's journals. He had left behind not just data, but detailed instructions. I learned how to graft queens, the delicate, surgical act of transferring a single larva to create a new monarch. I learned how to read the moods of the hives, to know when to split a thriving colony to prevent a swarm. Following his precise, hand-drawn diagrams, I built wooden windbreaks at the edge of the property, protecting the hives from the harsh north wind he had warned about. I was no longer just the caretaker of his bees. I was becoming a beekeeper in my own right. My first winter was lean. The first harvest under the Fox Hollow Hiveworks name was small. I had only produced a few hundred jars, not enough to make a real profit, by any business metric I had been taught at Norval. My first year was a failure. The production volume was low, the margins were thin, and my market was microscopic. But one cool evening, as the sun set over the fields, I opened a jar from that first harvest. It was a batch of late-season goldenrod, a complex, almost spicy flavor. I took a small spoonful, closed my eyes, and tasted it. It was perfect. It was the taste of the sun, the soil, the rain, and the tireless work of thousands of my tiny winged partners. The yield was low. Yes, but the flavor was irrefutable. It was pure, honest, and powerful. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it would be enough. The call came on a Monday morning, a digital summons from a world I had already left behind. It was an email from Norval's IT department. The subject line, a sterile and ominous, mandatory security protocol. It informed me that my company-issued laptop was being recalled for a routine security audit. I laughed. A short, sharp sound that startled a bee resting on the windowsill. A routine audit. They were going to wipe the drive, erasing any trace of my work, my correspondence, my existence. They were trying to sterilize the crime scene after the fact. But they were too late. The original laptop sat on my desk, a dormant black rectangle. The insurance folder, my meticulously collected evidence, was no longer on it. It was safely nestled on a tiny microSD card, which I had then sealed with a drop of warm beeswax into a hollowed-out groove on a spare wooden hive frame. It was leaning against the wall of the honey shed, hidden in plain sight, protected by the scent of honey and the latent threat of a million tiny soldiers. They could have my laptop. The soul of the machine was already gone. 2 days after I couriered the laptop back to them, the next predictable move arrived in my personal inbox. It was an email from Grant Oster, The tone was sickeningly friendly, dripping with the false magnanimity of a victor. "Marin," it began, "hope you're doing well and enjoying your time off. Listen, after the success of the B-track pitch, things are moving at lightning speed here. We're expanding, and an opportunity has opened up that I immediately thought of you for. We're opening a new logistics hub in Omaha, and we need a sharp analyst to lead the setup. It's a big responsibility. Of course, it would mean relocating, but the company would cover everything. All it would require is your signature on a standard non-disclosure and future works agreement, just to formalize your new role and protect the company's intellectual property moving forward." I read the email twice, marveling at its corporate villainy. He was offering me exile disguised as a promotion, move me 1,000 miles away, bury me in a new role, and buy my silence with a gag order. The future works agreement was the real poison pill. It would give Norval legal claim over anything I created, including Fox Hollow Hiveworks. He wasn't just trying to bury his theft. He was trying to steal its future profits, too. I clicked reply. My response was a single word: no. The fallout was immediate. Less than an hour later, I received an official summons from Human Resources. A calendar invite for a disciplinary review meeting appeared. The location listed as the main boardroom on the 27th floor. The agenda was a single, chilling bullet point: investigation into unauthorized removal of corporate assets. The trap was set. They had a narrative. The disgruntled employee, passed over for a promotion, steals company data on her way out. It was clean, simple, and utterly false. They expected me to walk in there, flustered and defensive, and crumble under the weight of their accusations. They had no idea I had been preparing for this meeting since the moment Grant stole my work. I spent the next day not with a lawyer, but with a chemist. I had already sent a sample of Dryline's signature product, Dryline Golden Blend, which Talia had discreetly acquired for me, to an independent food lab. The results came back the morning of the meeting. I printed the 2-page report, the clinical language a beautiful and damning indictment. I also called my legal counsel, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Alvarez, whom I had put on retainer the week I quit. I forwarded her the package of evidence I had assembled. She was particularly interested in one document Talia had managed to leak to me a week prior, the executed MOU with Dryline Sugars. At the bottom, next to the Dryline CEO's signature and the Norval VP's, was a third signature line. It was my name, a clumsy, pixelated forgery of my digital signature, likely lifted from an old expense report. Grant hadn't just stolen my work. He had used my name to co-sign a fraudulent deal, implicating me in his dirty scheme. It was a fatal overreach. When I walked into the boardroom, the atmosphere was glacial. 3 figures sat at the far end of the long mahogany table: Brenda, the head of HR, a woman with a helmet of lacquered hair and the eyes of a hanging judge; Mr. Carlyle, Norval's chief in-house counsel, looking bored and weary; and Grant Oster, who sat between them, radiating a smug, unearned confidence. He was the picture of a man who believed he had already won. "Marin, thank you for coming," Brenda began, her voice devoid of any warmth. "We've called this meeting because of a serious security breach. It has come to our attention that, prior to your departure, a significant amount of proprietary data related to the B-Track initiative was downloaded from the company network to an unauthorized external device. We have logs. Marin." I stood at the opposite end of the table. I didn't take a seat. I placed my leather satchel on the gleaming wood and calmly unzipped it. "You have logs," I said, my voice steady and clear, echoing slightly in the vast, silent room. "I have proof." I took out a single, small glass jar and placed it gently on the table. It was a sample jar of the Dryline Golden Blend. "Let's start with your new partner," I said. "Dryline Sugars, the foundation of the B-Track initiative's supply chain. I was so intrigued by their product that I had it professionally analyzed." I slid the lab report across the polished surface. It glided silently, coming to a stop directly in front of Mr. Carlyle. As you can see from the gas chromatography results on page 2, Dryline's golden blend is composed of less than 40% actual sucrose. The rest is a proprietary mixture of brown rice syrup and synthetic, lab-derived flavor enhancers. It's a cheap, industrial filler, designed to mimic the taste of real sugar at a fraction of the cost. You're not partnering with a sugar supplier, you're partnering with a fraud. Carlyle picked up the report, his weariness replaced by a flicker of sharp interest. Grant's smug expression faltered, replaced by a confused frown. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but I was already moving on. Now, let's talk about the B-Track initiative itself, I said, pulling my personal laptop from my bag and placing it on the table. You've accused me of stealing corporate assets, but one cannot steal what one already owns. I turned the laptop to face them and clicked a single file. A slide appeared on the screen, a side-by-side comparison. On the left was a screenshot of the email I sent to Grant at 10:17 a.m., on the day of the presentation, my original deck. The urban pollination loop was clearly attached. On the right was a screenshot of the file properties for Grant's presentation. The B-Track initiative. Please direct your attention to the metadata, I said, my voice as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. My file, authored by me, was created over a period of 6 months. Grant's file, as you can see, was created at 10:24 a.m., just 7 minutes after I emailed him my work. The author name was changed, the title was changed, but the metadata doesn't lie. It is a digital fingerprint of intellectual property theft. A heavy silence descended on the room. Grant's face had gone pale, a blotchy, unhealthy white. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. Brenda looked from the screen to Carlyle, her corporate armor beginning to crack. Furthermore, I continued, my voice dropping slightly, becoming even quieter, even more dangerous. I was recently made aware of the MOU executed with Dryline. I clicked to the next slide, displaying a high-resolution image of the signature page. I had used a red box to highlight the forgery of my name. I have never seen this document before in my life, yet that is my name, clumsily forged onto a contract committing this company to a fraudulent supplier. That isn't just unethical, it's wire fraud. Mr. Carlyle let out a long, slow sigh. It was the sound of a man watching a simple HR matter metastasize into a full-blown legal catastrophe. He closed his eyes for a moment, then looked directly at Grant. There was no sympathy in his gaze, only a cold, professional fury. Grant, Carlyle said, his voice dangerously soft. Is this true? Grant stammered, looking for a life raft in a sea of his own making. She's twisting things. This is a disgruntled employee. The metadata doesn't get disgruntled. Grant, I cut in, my voice sharp. The gas chromatograph doesn't have a grudge. Carlyle held up a hand, silencing Grant. He looked at me, a grudging respect in his tired eyes. Ms. Vale, what is it that you want? Want? I gave a small, humorless laugh. I don't want anything from you. I came here today as a courtesy, to show you the rot in your own house. You can have the B-Track initiative. You can have your fraudulent partners and your data-thieving executives. I'm building something real. I reached into my satchel one last time and pulled out a small, crisp business card. I walked the length of the table and placed it in front of the silent, shell-shocked Brenda. As for my resignation, I said, my voice ringing with a finality that left no room for argument, you can consider it effective immediately. I turned and walked toward the door, not looking back. The card sat on the table, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. On it, in clean, simple font, were 3 lines. Fox Hollow Hiveworks. Marin Vale. Founder, a true partner to the flowers. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out into the hallway, the heavy boardroom door clicking shut behind me, sealing them in with the mess they had created. I walked directly to the elevator bank, my footsteps echoing in the cathedral-like silence of the executive floor. As the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, I stepped inside. The car began its swift, silent descent, With every floor we passed, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, a pressure I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for years. The weight of being undervalued, of being invisible, of fighting for a place at a table that was always rigged. When the doors opened onto the ground floor lobby, I stepped out into a river of sunlight streaming through the vast glass atrium. I walked through the revolving doors and out onto the street, into the chaotic, vibrant noise of the city. I took a deep breath of the cool autumn air. It tasted of exhaust fumes and freedom, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt lighter than the wind. Freedom, I discovered, was not a state of rest. It was a state of relentless, kinetic energy. With the ghost of Norval finally exorcised, I poured every ounce of my being into Fox Hollow Hiveworks. The confrontation had provided closure. Now it was time for the explosion. My revenge wouldn't be a single, surgical strike in a boardroom. It would be a sustained, undeniable campaign of success, built on the one thing my old world could never replicate: authenticity. My first move was to weaponize the truth. I knew my honey was good, but in a crowded artisanal market, a good product wasn't enough. It needed a narrative. I decided to give every jar a voice. I launched the Story Honey collection. Each label, with its hand-stamped bloom date, now also featured a small, discreet QR code. I spent a week in the fields with a second-hand camera, filming. The resulting videos were raw and intimate, just 45 seconds long. Scan the code on a jar of wild apple blossom, bloom May 14 to 20, and your phone would play a clip of the gnarled apple trees in full, glorious bloom, the air thick with bees. It would flash to a data visualization from my dashboard, a spike in hive activity for that exact week, then show the rich, pale honey being spun from the frame, and end with a final shot of the sealed and dated jar. It wasn't an ad. It was a birth certificate. I wasn't selling honey. I was selling a transparent, verifiable piece of a specific week on Earth. For a month, the only result was a slow trickle of sales from my small online store. Then, the spark landed. The order came from North Mill, an experimental restaurant in the city known for its notoriously picky head chef, a culinary demigod named Julian Croft. He ordered a single jar of each of my 6 varieties. A week later, my phone began to buzz and didn't stop. Chef Croft had posted a video to his massive social media following. It showed a honey flight on a stark white plate, 6 dollops of honey, ranging from pale gold to dark molasses. The video showed him tasting each one, his eyes closing in silent reverence. He didn't speak. He simply scanned the QR code on my black sage honey jar. The 45-second story of its creation filled the screen. The video ended with a single line of text on a black background. "This is not honey. This is terroir. This is truth." The impact was instantaneous and overwhelming. My online store's traffic spiked by 3,000% in 1 hour. By the end of the day, online orders were up 12-fold. I sold out of my entire winter stock in 72 hours. My quiet little project had become a viral sensation. The honey that tells a story, one blogger called it. The sudden demand was both exhilarating and terrifying. My small honey shed became a frantic logistics hub. I called Talia, my voice shaking with a mixture of panic and glee. "I have 180 orders to fill by Friday. I don't even have enough boxes." Talia's response was calm and decisive. "I'm on my way." That weekend, we turned chaos into a company. While I managed the frantic back end of the inventory, Talia, with her sharp marketing mind and logistical prowess, built the scaffolding of a real business. "First, we are no longer a project," she declared, pulling out her laptop at my kitchen table. "As of this afternoon, we are Fox Hollow Hiveworks, LLC. By Sunday evening, she had filed the paperwork, opened a commercial bank account, and set up a proper shipping account with the post office. She was no longer a weekend volunteer. She was my chief operating officer. We were a team. To handle the local demand, I bypassed the slow, complex distributor route. I loaded up my grandfather's old dented pickup truck, a machine that ran on stubbornness and smelled perpetually of hay, and drove. I went to the 5 best specialty food shops in the 3 surrounding towns. I didn't go in with a sales pitch. I went in with an open jar and a spoon. I let the honey speak for itself. By the end of the week, I had 5 signed contracts. Driving home in that rattling old truck, the bed loaded with empty boxes and the cab filled with signed purchase orders, I felt a connection to my grandfather I never had before. This was how he had done it. With a handshake and a quality product. I had just added a QR code to the business model. The real test of my system came with the buckwheat bloom. My hive sensors showed a dramatic spike in activity and a change in the acoustic frequency of the hive buzz. A lower, more intense hum, cross-referencing with my grandfather's notes. I knew this was it, the golden week of the buckwheat nectar flow. For 7 days, the bees worked in a frenzy. The resulting honey was unlike anything else. Dark, molasses-rich, with a malty, unforgettable flavor. I bottled the limited run, updating the website with a countdown clock. The entire batch of the notoriously potent buckwheat honey sold out in 36 hours, crashing my server twice. This was the proof of concept. My blend of old-world observation and new-world data had created a product and a demand that was predictable and powerful. The local press started to notice. A popular regional food blog, Hometown Palette, ran a feature story. The headline read, "Fox Hollow Hiveworks, a flavor map of the region made of living data." The article was a watershed moment, cementing our identity. We weren't just artisanal, we were intelligent. We weren't just a farm, we were a data-driven terroir project. With Talia managing the explosive growth, I had the freedom to innovate. I hated the idea of waste. After the honey was extracted, I was left with mounds of pure, fragrant beeswax. Following another of my grandfather's passions, we launched a new product line, No Waste Wax. We hand-poured candles into simple glass tumblers, but on the front of each candle, we used a laser engraver to etch the geographic coordinates of the specific field of flowers the wax came from. We sold them as a Bloom and Glow combo pack, a jar of honey and a candle from the very same nectar flow. They were an instant hit. The most meaningful order, however, came not from a chef or a boutique, but from a local elementary school. The 4th grade science teacher emailed me, explaining she had used our website and videos to teach her class about pollination. She wanted to order 200 of our smallest jars for the students to take home, but she also had a proposal. In return for a small discount, the 4th grade class wanted to partner with us. They would spend the next spring planting a 2-acre pollinator garden on unused school property. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. My little company wasn't just a success. It was becoming a force for good, planting the seeds for the next generation of flowers and bee lovers. Through all this explosive growth, I made a very conscious and deliberate pricing decision. We could have easily positioned ourselves as a luxury brand, charging exorbitant prices for our unique, data-verified honey. Talia and I had the debate one night over a pile of shipping labels. We could charge 50% more and still sell out, she argued, ever the COO. No, I said firmly, my mind fixed on the memory of my parents' mocking laughter in their pristine dining room. The price stays where it is. It needs to be accessible. Accessible to who? Talia asked, confused. To everyone, I said. It needs to be just expensive enough to feel special, but affordable enough that anyone who's curious can buy it. I want it to be the kind of thing someone might pick up at the specialty market in Lakesend on a whim. Talia looked at me, and a slow dawn of understanding broke across her face. Oh, she said softly, I see. It was a quiet, critical part of my plan. I didn't want my success to be some abstract headline they read about in a magazine. I wanted them to be able to walk into a store, pick it up, and hold it in their hands. I wanted them to see my name on the label. And most of all, I wanted them to have to pay for the privilege of tasting just how wrong they had been. One night, long after midnight, I was alone in the honey shed, now a humming nexus of production. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of cardboard and sweet wax. I was packing the last of the school's order, my hands moving on autopilot, my body thrumming with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that was more satisfying than any sleep I'd ever known. I switched on my grandfather's old radio, the one he'd kept on a dusty shelf. I turned the dial, and the speakers crackled to life, filled mostly with static, the faint ghost of a distant music station drifting in and out. The sound filled the quiet shed, a soft, white noise. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening. The hiss and crackle of the static sounded exactly like the gentle, contented hum of a million bees, all working together in the dark. The call came, as I knew it eventually would. The catalyst wasn't the viral video from the chef or the niche food blogs. It was an article in the glossy Sunday supplement of a national newspaper, a full-page feature with a slick professional photograph of my honey jars gleaming in the afternoon sun. The headline was simple: "The Data Beekeeper of Fox Hollow." It was the kind of respectable mainstream press that my parents could show their friends at the country club. It made my strange hobby tangible to them, translating it into the only language they truly understood: social currency. My mother's voice on the phone was a masterclass in tonal whiplash, shifting from feigned nonchalance to grasping ambition in a single breath. "Marin, darling, I saw that little piece in the paper. How lovely. You're quite the clever girl, aren't you?" There was a pause, just long enough for the compliment to curdle. "Listen, your father and I were just talking. He has a wonderful business idea he wants to discuss with you. We'll pop over this afternoon." It wasn't a request. It was an announcement. They arrived precisely at 2:00, their gleaming black SUV crunching unnervingly on my gravel driveway. It was a vehicle designed for conquering suburban parking lots, and it looked absurdly out of place among the wildflowers. My parents, Harold and Denise, emerged, followed by my cousin Kyle. They looked like they had been dressed by a stylist for an L.L. Bean catalog shoot. My father wore a brand-new, crisp plaid shirt and stiff, dark-wash jeans that had never seen a day of actual work. My mother was in tailored khaki trousers and hiking boots, so pristine the soles were still white. Kyle wore a fleece vest over a polo shirt, his face a mask of predatory enthusiasm. They weren't visiting my home. They were staging an acquisition. "The place is looking rustic," my mother commented, her eyes scanning the slightly overgrown yard as if looking for a health code violation. "You've done a lot with it," my father added, a statement that was meant to sound encouraging but landed with the thud of profound condescension. I led them to the porch, to the same wicker chairs where Talia and I had tasted honey and built a dream. They seemed uncomfortable in them, as if accustomed to the rigid structure of boardroom seating. I said nothing, simply went inside to prepare the tea I had already planned on. When I returned, they had wasted no time. Spread across my small wooden table was a large, glossy schematic, a flowchart full of arrows and corporate buzzwords. Kyle was pointing to a box at the top. "It's a three-pronged expansion strategy," he was saying, his voice filled with the unearned confidence of a man who has only ever read about business. "Phase 1 is scaling production. Phase 2 is leveraging your social media buzz for national distribution. Phase 3 is brand diversification." "It's brilliant, Marin," my father said, taking over as Kyle retreated. He puffed out his chest, adopting the patriarchal tone he used for matters of great importance. "The family has to stick together in ventures like this. We've mapped out a new corporate structure. I'll handle the financials and investor relations. I have the experience. After all, your mother can manage marketing and PR. And you," he smiled benevolently, "you can continue doing what you do best, managing the product, the human resources of the bees, if you will." He was offering to demote me in my own company. He wanted to take my creation, my hard-won success, and turn me into a folksy, sentimental mascot while they ran the numbers. Kyle would no doubt be given a title like Director of Strategic Growth. I felt a cold, calm clarity settle over me. This wasn't an offer of help. This was a hostile takeover disguised as a family intervention. I said nothing. I simply placed the tray on the table. On it were 4 cups and a steaming pot of lavender tea I had brewed with flowers from my own garden. The calming scent seemed to actively offend their aggressive ambition. I also brought out my grandfather's oldest ledger, the one bound in cracked leather. I placed it on the table next to their garish flowchart, its quiet, dignified presence a rebuke to their glossy plans. My mother waved a dismissive hand at their chart. "What your father means, dear, is that you need adult guidance. This little viral moment you're having is lovely, but it's fleeting. To get Fox Hollow products into a real supermarket chain, you need experience. You need someone who can negotiate with the big players." She glanced at the video of the Queen Walk playing on a loop on my tablet nearby, her expression a mixture of fascination and disgust. A slow smile touched my lips. It was the first one since they had arrived. "Actually," I said, my voice soft, "I've already turned down offers from 2 major supermarket chains." The effect was instantaneous. 3 faces stared back at me, their expressions of smug certainty collapsing into slack-jawed disbelief. "You what?" my father sputtered. They wanted exclusivity and demanded I start using corn syrup extenders to guarantee consistent volume for their shelves. I explained calmly. It would have destroyed the entire principle of the brand, so I said no. I prefer the small specialty shops, better margins, and they respect the product. I had just vaporized their entire premise. They had come here assuming I was a naive girl who had stumbled into success and was desperately in need of rescue. The revelation that I was a competent businesswoman who had already made strategic decisions far beyond their imagination left them speechless. Kyle recovered first, his mind quickly shifting from one greedy angle to another. Okay, fine," he said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Forget the chains, but you're still thinking too small. I have a friend. He's the beverage director at Skyline, one of the top restaurants in the city. I can get you a meeting. They'll put Fox Hollow on the menu. A signature cocktail, everything. All I'd need is a finder's fee and, say, a 60% stake in the company to manage corporate partnerships." 60%. He wanted to steal my company in exchange for a single meeting. I didn't even look at him. My gaze was on my grandfather's ledger. I opened it to the first page. In his familiar, shaky handwriting was a simple mission statement he had written for himself 50 years ago. I placed my finger on the page. "No," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. I looked up, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "There is only one way the family gets to be involved in this company, and that is by agreeing to the rules my grandfather established on day 1. I tapped the ledger. Rule 1. We do not sell the land, ever. Rule 2. We do not sell our queen bees. We raise our own. Rule 3. We do not blend or adulterate our honey. 1 bloom, 1 jar. Rule 4. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the suddenly silent air. "Is that anyone who works this land must actually work this land. There are no silent partners at Fox Hollow." My father let out a short, derisive laugh. "That's not a business plan, Marin. That's a poem." "You'll hit your ceiling very quickly with that attitude," my mother added, already gathering her purse, her brief fantasy of a family empire evaporating. "You'll be a quaint little story, and then you'll be gone." They stood up, their new clothes looking even more stiff and ridiculous than before. Their plan had failed. Their condescension had found no purchase. There was nothing left for them to do but retreat. They walked back to their enormous SUV, their collective disappointment radiating from them like heat. I didn't walk them to their car. I stood on the porch, watching them go. My father paused before getting in the driver's seat and looked back at me, a strange expression on his face. It wasn't anger, it was confusion. The look of a man who has just realized the world no longer operates according to the rules he has always understood. The SUV door slammed shut, and the vehicle lumbered down the gravel path, disappearing behind a curtain of old elm trees. The sound of its engine faded, replaced by a much older, more powerful sound. It was the low, steady hum of the hives, rising and falling in the warm afternoon air. It was the sound of tens of thousands of individuals all working together for a common goal. I closed my eyes and listened. It sounded like they were casting a vote. He came on a Tuesday. When the air was crisp with the promise of late autumn, I was out by the hives, performing a final check before winter, the scent of wood smoke and honey thick around me, a sleek, dark sedan, a car that belonged in a high-rise parking garage, crunched to a stop at the end of my driveway. For a moment, I thought my parents had returned for another misguided attempt at a corporate takeover, but the man who emerged was thinner, paler, and infinitely more haunted. It was Grant Oster. He had traded his usual armor of smug confidence for a crumpled navy suit and a haunted look in his eyes. The last time I had seen him, he was at the head of a mahogany table, basking in the glow of a stolen idea. Now, he stood hesitantly on the gravel path, looking at the riot of wildflowers and the buzzing hives as if they were alien life forms. He was a creature of the fluorescent-lit, climate-controlled world, and the raw, untamed energy of my farm seemed to physically diminish him. I didn't invite him in. I simply closed the hive I was working on, stripped off my gloves, and leaned against the old pickup truck. Crossing my arms, I waited. The silence was mine to command. He finally walked toward me, his expensive leather shoes crunching awkwardly on the loose stones. "Marin," he said, his voice raspy, "you've done a lot with the place." "I'm busy, Grant. What do you want?" He winced at my tone but pressed on, attempting to summon some of his old corporate swagger. "I'm here to propose a reconciliation," he began, the words sounding absurd in the open air. "Norval is prepared to move past our misunderstanding. They see the value in what you're doing here, this sensor-based apiary model. It's scalable. They want to buy the exclusive rights to your data protocols, your entire system. They want to replicate it." It was the most audacious, predictable thing I had ever heard. First, they sanction the theft of my idea. Then they try to buy the real, successful version after their own corrupted attempt implodes. "Replicate it?" I laughed. A single, sharp bark. "You can't replicate this, Grant. The part you don't understand is that the system isn't the sensors. It's the bees. It's the soil. You can't download that onto a server." "Everything has a price," he shot back, a flicker of his old self returning. "Norval is prepared to be very generous, and in return for this deal, they can offer you a lot." "And what exactly are you offering to trade for my company's soul?" I asked, my voice dripping with ice. "Legal protection, for one," he said, and there it was, the veiled threat. "You're a small player. Marin, as you grow, you'll attract a lot of unwanted attention. Norval can make sure you're protected. And second," he leaned in, playing what he thought was his trump card, "a national distribution chain. We can put Fox Hollow honey in every major city in the country within 6 months. You'll be a household name." He was offering me a gilded cage, the same one I had just escaped. He thought I still wanted the things he valued: scale, market penetration, a brand name built by a corporate machine. I didn't say a word. I simply walked over to the porch, picked up a thin, plastic-bound document that had been sitting on the wicker table, and walked back. I held it out to him. It was a copy of Norval's internal investigation report on the B-Track initiative, leaked to me by a still loyal Talia. "I believe you've seen this," I said quietly. He flinched as if I had struck him. His eyes darted down to the cover page, then back up to mine, filled with a new kind of fear. He knew what it said. He knew that on page 12, paragraph 3, it concluded unequivocally that he, Grant Oster, had knowingly altered the metadata on a presentation file to remove a subordinate's name and claim credit for her work. It was the official record of his crime. My placing it in his hand wasn't a threat. It was a simple reminder of the truth. It was a reminder of who held all the cards. The fight went out of him instantly. His shoulders slumped. The wrinkles on his suit seemed to deepen. He looked down at the report in his hand, then let it drop to the ground. "They fired me," he whispered, the words swallowed by the vast, quiet landscape. "The board used the dry line fraud as the public reason. But this, he nudged the report with his shoe. This is what really did it. I lost everything. My stock options, my severance, my wife left me. He looked up at me, and the man who had tried to ruin me was gone. In his place was a pathetic, broken shell. I'm unemployable. Marin, my name is Poison. I came here. I came here to ask you for a job. The twist was so sudden, so deeply pathetic, it almost gave me vertigo. A job? Yes, he said, his voice cracking. A technical job. I can help you with the sensor arrays, the data analysis. I'll work in the back. No name on any reports. No title. Just a salary. I'm broke. Marin, I have nothing. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt a flicker of pity, but then I looked past him, at the neat rows of white hives standing against the tree line. I thought of my grandfather, of his calloused hands and his fierce, quiet integrity. I thought of the old baker who remembered his honest honey, and the farmers my parents had spoken of, the ones squeezed out of existence by corporate giants run by men exactly like Grant Oster. This wasn't just about me and him anymore. It was about the world I was trying to build versus the one he had helped create. I can't give you a job, Grant, I said, my voice flat and final. But I am going to give you a lesson in business. You see, you and Norval still think this is about a proprietary system to be bought and sold. You're wrong. I took a deep breath. I'm not selling my data protocols to anyone. Next month, I'm sharing them. I'm releasing the entire methodology, the sensor schematics, the dashboard code, the analytical framework, as an open source package to a cooperative of local, independent beekeepers I'm helping to form. He stared at me, his desperation curdling into disbelief. Open source? Are you insane? You're giving away your only advantage. You're giving away the secret. The secret isn't the tech, Grant. The secret is collaboration. It's building a community so strong and transparent that predatory companies like Norval can't get a foothold. It's about 100 small apiaries sharing data to predict blooms and pests, all producing real, honest honey under their own labels. That's a supply chain you can't buy. That's a brand you can't fake. He let out a dry, rattling laugh. It was a terrible sound. You really don't get it, he sneered, a shadow of his old self returning. You don't understand the rules of the game. The big players will crush you. They'll crush your little co-op. They always do. No, Grant, I said, looking him directly in the eye, the hum of the hives a steady, powerful chorus at my back. I understand the rules perfectly. That's why I'm not playing. I'm changing them. He had nothing left to say. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked back to his car. A ghost retreating from the light. He opened the car door, but paused before getting in. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope and tossed it onto the ground. Your call, he said, his voice flat. Then he got in the car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. I waited until the sound of his engine was completely gone. I walked over and picked up the envelope. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a multi-page legal document. It was a purchase offer, not from Norval, but from a shell corporation I'd never heard of. They were offering to buy my land, the 2 acres of Fox Hollow Hiveworks, for a sum of money so large it made my head swim. It was enough to live on for the rest of my life, 3 times over, without ever working another day. It was go-away money. It was a final, desperate attempt to erase me and my inconvenient ideas. That night, after the sun had set, I sat on the porch. I lit one of my no-waste wax candles, the one etched with the coordinates of the clover field. Its flame was steady and bright, smelling faintly of summer. I took the contract out of its envelope, page by page. I didn't rip it. I held the corner of the first page to the candle's flame. It caught fire, the orange light illuminating the dense legal jargon before turning it black. The flame consumed the numbers, the clauses, the empty promises. I dropped the burning page into a metal bucket and watched it curl into a fragile, black skeleton of itself. I did this with every page, a quiet, deliberate ceremony. When the last page was gone, A gust of wind blew across the porch. It stirred the contents of the bucket, lifting the delicate, blackened ashes into the air. They floated up into the dark, swirling like a cloud of tiny, dark insects, before scattering across the fields. They looked just like pollen, disappearing into the night to seed a future of their own making. The invitation from Meadowline arrived not as a phone call, but as a formal email with their clean, green logo at the top. It felt less like a sales inquiry and more like a diplomatic summons. Meadowline wasn't just a grocery chain. It was a cultural institution, a tastemaker in the world of clean, ethical food. Their headquarters, a glass and bamboo structure in the affluent suburb of Crestview, was a temple to sustainable capitalism. To be invited there was to be anointed. The news, of course, traveled fast. I hadn't told my parents. But the local paper ran a small business brief. Fox Hollow Hiveworks to present to Meadowline leadership. It was all the opening my mother needed. Her phone call was a masterclass in diplomacy I had to grudgingly admire. There was no talk of business plans or corporate structures, just a soft, tentative, "Marin, darling, we saw the news. We are just so proud of you. Would it be all right if your father and I came? Just to watch? We'd sit in the back. We wouldn't say a word." The request was so nakedly desperate, so stripped of all their previous arrogance, that I found I couldn't refuse. This was a crucial part of their education. "All right," I said, my voice even. "But you understand the condition. You sit at the back of the room, and you do not speak. To anyone." "Of course, dear," she breathed, the relief in her voice palpable. "We wouldn't dream of it." The day of the presentation, I arrived an hour early. The Meadowline headquarters was even more imposing in person. It didn't feel like a corporate office. It felt like a gigantic, serene terrarium. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating polished concrete floors and walls of living moss. The air smelled of filtered water and faint, expensive green tea. It was the epitome of clean, controlled nature. I was bringing the wilderness inside. The receptionist's polite smile faltered for a fraction of a second when she saw what I was wheeling in on a small dolly. It was a custom-built, vertical observation hive, a thin slice of a living, breathing colony, sandwiched between two thick panes of acrylic. A sealed tube at the top allowed for ventilation, but the entrance was securely corked. It was a self-contained, humming, 6-foot column of life. Tens of thousands of bees were moving in their ancient hypnotic patterns, tending to the queen, feeding larvae, communicating through their intricate dance. It was the most honest thing that had ever entered this building. I was escorted to the main boardroom on the top floor. It was a beautiful, minimalist space with a single, massive table made from a slab of reclaimed oak. The chairs were elegant leather and brushed steel. I placed the observation hive at the head of the table, where a CEO would normally sit. The low, collective hum of the bees was the only sound in the room, a stark, living contrast to the polite, corporate silence. My parents arrived 20 minutes later, looking small and intensely nervous. They were dressed in their Sunday best, their faces a mixture of terror and awe as they took in the panoramic view of the city. As promised, they took 2 chairs against the back wall, sitting with the rigid posture of people trying to become invisible. The executives filed in. They were exactly what I expected. Fit, intelligent-looking men and women in expensive but understated clothing. They all noticed the hive. Some looked intrigued, others confused, but they were all too professional to comment. They took their seats, their eyes flicking from me to the living column of insects that presided over the meeting. I didn't start with a greeting. I started with a clicker. The massive screen behind me lit up. There were no logos, no buzzwords, just a single sentence in a clean, sans serif font, set against a macro photograph of a bee's wing. Logistics, learned from bees. The shortest path is not drawn by a boss. It is discovered by the swarm. I let the sentence hang in the air for a long moment. Then I turned, not to the screen, but to the hive. "For the past year," I began, my voice clear and calm. I have been studying the most efficient supply chain on the planet. It's not run by algorithms or managed by executives. It's run by them. I gestured to the bees. A single colony can visit over 250,000 flowers in a day, collecting nectar and pollen, and communicating the precise location of the most valuable resources with 98% accuracy. They don't have meetings. They don't have managers. They have a single shared mission: the health of the hive. They are the ultimate data-driven collective. I glanced toward the back of the room. My mother's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. My father, the man of numbers and sensible investments, was leaning forward, his pen scratching furiously on a legal pad. They were watching the Meadowline executives, who were all, to a person, utterly captivated. They were leaning forward, their polite corporate masks replaced with genuine intellectual curiosity. My phone, sitting on the table, buzzed, a text from Kyle. "They look interested. Remember your family when you sign. 10% for the intro idea." I ignored it, a bitter smile touching my lips. He still thought this was about a simple transaction. Fox Hollow Hiveworks was founded on this principle, I continued, clicking to the next slide, which showed an elegant data visualization of my hive sensor network. We don't just harvest honey, we listen to the bees. We use their collective intelligence to create a product that is not just artisanal, but radically transparent, a product that tells a story of a specific time and a specific place. Then, I made my pitch. It wasn't a pitch for them to simply buy my honey. It was a pitch for a new kind of partnership. "I'm not here to ask for shelf space," I said, looking each executive in the eye. "I'm here to propose an ecosystem. I call it the neighborhood pollination model." I laid it out. For every major metropolitan area where Meadowline had a strong presence, they would sponsor the creation of 2 public pollinator gardens, in parks, on rooftops, in community spaces. Fox Hollow Hiveworks, through its new open-source cooperative, would establish a small, local apiary to service those gardens. In return for that community investment, each Meadowline store in that city would get the exclusive right to sell the single-bloom honey that came from their sponsored gardens. "You won't just be selling honey," I concluded. "You will be selling a story that your customers helped to write. You will be selling the taste of their own neighborhood. It's not just farm to table, it's community to table." The room was silent. I had taken their core brand value, community-focused, sustainable food, and given them a way to embody it on a whole new level. Finally, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, the VP of Operations, spoke. "It's a brilliant concept, Ms. Vale, brilliant, but it's also a legal minefield. Granting exclusivity on that level, a larger, more aggressive competitor could sue us for anti-competitive practices. They could argue we're creating a monopoly." It was the question I had been waiting for, the stress test, the moment that separated a good idea from a viable business. I smiled. That would only be a risk if this were a simple commercial agreement, which it is not. I reached into my satchel and pulled out another document. It wasn't a business proposal. It was a letter, on official letterhead, from the Fox Hollow Town Council. "This," I said, placing it on the table, "is a letter of intent, the town of Fox Hollow, in recognition of our work with the local elementary school and our commitment to local agriculture, has established a Green Futures Fund. They are officially designating our neighborhood pollination model as a public-private partnership aimed at increasing urban biodiversity. This isn't a commercial monopoly. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a civic initiative. It's not about cornering a market. It's about building a greener community. Any company that sues you for that will be suing a town, a school, and a public park. I wish them the best of luck with that PR." A full minute of profound, unbroken silence followed. The only sound was the steady, gentle hum of the bees in the observation hive. The executives looked at each other, then back at me. I hadn't just come with a product. I hadn't just come with an idea. I had come with a bulletproof strategy. I had changed the rules of the game, turning a potential weakness into an unassailable strength. Finally, the CEO, A man with a calm, authoritative presence leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Ms. Vale," he said, his voice resonating with a finality that told me I had won. "There is just one question." He paused. "You mention a cooperative. You mention local apiaries. To make this model work, we would need dozens of farms just like yours, all operating at the same high standard. Can you train them?" The future of my company, of my grandfather's legacy, of this new world I was trying to build, hung on my answer. I looked at the bees, my partners, moving with their calm, eternal purpose. I thought of the open-source protocols I was building. I thought of all the other small farmers who deserved a chance to fight back. I nodded. "Yes," I said. "I can—" "Then I believe we have the framework of a deal," he said. A ripple of assent went through the room. The framework, the beginning, but it was not yet the end. "I believe we do," I replied. "But for Fox Hollow Hiveworks to agree, there is one final condition." A palpable sense of relief and excitement filled the boardroom. The Meadowline executives were smiling, a low murmur of conversation starting up as they began to process the framework of the deal. They saw a future of growth, of a powerful new story to tell their customers. They saw a partnership, but I saw an incomplete equation. The hive was not yet whole. I held up a hand, and the murmuring stopped. The CEO looked at me, a question in his eyes. I didn't address him. Instead, I slowly turned away from the gleaming oak table, away from the men and women who held the keys to my commercial future. I turned to face the back of the room, to the two silent, rigid figures sitting against the far wall. A ripple of confusion went through the room. The executives followed my gaze, their expressions shifting from business to curiosity. My parents, suddenly the focus of a dozen powerful eyes, shrank in their chairs. "Harold and Denise Vale," I said, my voice clear and carrying across the vast space. "Would you please come forward?" The request was so unexpected, so bizarrely out of place in the context of a corporate negotiation, that for a moment no one moved. My parents looked at me, then at each other, their faces pale with shock. My father made a small, almost imperceptible gesture, a shake of the head, as if to say, "Not now, not here." But I did not look away. My gaze was steady, insistent. Slowly, hesitantly, they stood up. The sound of their chairs scraping against the polished floor was unnervingly loud in the silent room. They walked the long path between the wall and the table, a walk of shame that felt miles long. They looked like defendants approaching the bench. They stopped a few feet away from me, standing isolated in the open space between me and the board. I turned back to the Meadowline CEO. "This is my final condition," I said, my voice calm and measured. "My parents have expressed a desire to be part of the Fox Hollow Hiveworks family, and our family." I paused, letting the words sink in. "Has rules." I looked directly at my mother and father. The years of their condescension, their dismissive laughter, their quiet disappointment, it all coalesced into this single crystalline moment of reckoning. "You both once told me that beekeeping was a game, a silly hobby for a girl who should have a real job," I said, my voice devoid of anger, stating it as a simple, undeniable fact. "Today, you've seen that this game has value. If you wish to participate in that value, if you wish to join this hive, then you must first learn what it means to be a bee." I let the metaphor settle. "My condition is this. Any family member who wishes to have a role in this company must first complete the same 6-week apiarist training course as every one of our cooperative partners. You will learn how to build a hive, how to inspect a frame, how to identify a healthy queen, and how to harvest honey with your own 2 hands. My mother's face, already pale, flushed a deep, mottled red. Her carefully constructed composure shattered. "Marin!" she gasped, her voice a sharp, strangled whisper. "What are you doing? Are you trying to humiliate me in front of these people?" "No, Mother," I replied, my voice softening almost imperceptibly. but losing none of its steel. I am protecting the hive, and I am protecting myself. No one gets to profit from this work who does not first respect the work, and respect begins with understanding. My father, ever the pragmatist, saw the path of this conversation more clearly. He knew this wasn't a negotiation, it was a sentencing. "What are the conditions?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "What are these rules?" I picked up my grandfather's worn leather journal from the table. I didn't need to open it. I knew the rules by heart. I held it out not as a book, but as a symbol of the company's constitution. "They are Grandpa's rules," I said, "and they are non-negotiable. First, we take on no high-interest debt, ever. We grow organically, not artificially. Second, we do not adulterate the product. The honey is the truth. Third, we do not sell the land. This ground is not a commodity. Fourth, all partners must sign with their real names. No shell corporations, no hiding. And fifth, 30% of all net profits are to be reinvested directly into the creation of new pollinator gardens and educational programs." From the corner of my eye, I saw Kyle, who had crept closer, lean in and whisper urgently to my father. "Just sign it, Harold. She's about to close the biggest deal of her life. Sign whatever she wants." He still didn't understand. He thought the rules were a piece of paper. He didn't realize they were a firewall. "There is one more rule," I said, my eyes locked on my parents. "The final condition." I took a slow breath, the air in the room feeling thick and heavy. "Before you sign anything, you will both apologize. Not to me, to the work. You will state for the record that you were wrong, that you unfairly belittled a craft you did not understand, and you will do it on camera, for our internal company records." This was the true price of entry, not the 6 weeks of work, but the single moment of absolute humility, the surrender of their pride. My mother stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fury. She opened her mouth to speak, to unleash years of maternal indignation, but then her gaze drifted past me, to the observation hive at the head of the table. She looked at the thousands of bees, moving in their complex, ceaseless patterns. She saw the queen, the calm center of it all. Surrounded by her attendants, she saw a world of order, of purpose, of an intelligence she could not comprehend. She saw a system that did not care about her opinion, her social standing, or her feelings. It only cared about the work. And in that moment, in the reflection of the acrylic, I saw the fury in her eyes flicker and die, replaced by a dawning, terrifying understanding. She finally understood that I wasn't her daughter making a demand. I was the queen of a new hive, stating the facts of its survival. My father was the first to break. He was a man of numbers, and he could see the final, irrefutable calculation. He looked at me, at the powerful executives watching him, at the contract that represented a future he desperately wanted to be a part of. He walked to the table, picked up the pen that the CEO had been using, and pulled the single-page document with my grandfather's rules toward him. His hand trembled slightly as he signed his name. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a weary, profound shame. "I'm sorry, Marin," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. "For everything, I'm sorry." My mother watched him, her face a blank mask of shock. Then, slowly, as if moving through water, she stepped forward. She took the pen from my father's hand. Her own signature was less steady than his, a spidery, uncertain mark on the page. She did not look at me. She looked at the floor. "I am sorry, too," she whispered. The room was utterly still. The deal with Meadowline, the millions of dollars, the national distribution, it all faded into the background. The only thing that mattered was this quiet, painful, and necessary transaction. The silence was broken only by the faint whir of the building's ventilation system, and the steady, ancient, reassuring hum of the bees, their wings beating in a soft, constant rhythm, the true and final signature on the deal. With the scratch of my mother's pen, The air in the boardroom seemed to change its molecular structure. The high-stakes tension of the negotiation dissolved, replaced by a heavy, profound stillness. The Meadowline executives, who had been witnessing a corporate pitch, now found themselves audience to a quiet, brutal family drama. They sat in perfect professional silence, their faces betraying nothing but a deep, watchful intelligence. They weren't just acquiring a product, they were investing in a leader, and they had just witnessed her consolidate her power in the most absolute way imaginable. I walked back to the head of the table, leaving my parents standing alone and untethered in the vast space. I picked up the pen they had used. It was cool and heavy in my hand. The Meadowline CEO pushed the framework agreement toward me. It was a thick document, full of clauses and subclauses, the product of 100 hours of legal work. I signed my name, Marin Vale, on the final page. My signature was firm and clear, the ink a stark, dark commitment against the clean white paper. Then, I turned to the addendum page. It was mostly blank. Instead of asking for a formal typewritten clause, I kept the pen in my hand. In my neatest, most deliberate script, I wrote a single sentence beneath the legalese. Addendum A. Fox Hollow Hiveworks commits to the full training and certification of 12 independent satellite apiaries within the next 12 months, establishing the initial cohort of the Neighborhood Pollination Cooperative. It was a promise, a handwritten bond that was more powerful to me than any of the printed text that preceded it. I pushed the document back across the table. The CEO read my addition, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his face. He stood up and extended his hand across the table. His grip was firm. "Welcome to the ecosystem, Ms. Vale," he said, his voice resonating with genuine respect. "We are honored to be a part of it." "The honor is mine," I replied, my voice steady. Our handshake was the official seal on a new world. My first act as his new partner was to turn my back on the deal and attend to my hive. I walked over to the tall, humming acrylic column. My movements were slow and methodical. I uncorked the feeder at the top and inserted a small vial of sugar water, ensuring they had sustenance. Then, I recorked the main entrance tube, the one that would eventually connect to the outside world. For now, they were a closed system, a self-contained world. The bees, sensing the shift, began to move with a new kind of purpose. They flowed in their thousands, a river of life, following the pheromone trails back toward the queen, their movements patient, precise, and perfectly coordinated. They were returning to the center. They were restoring order. As I worked, a hesitant voice spoke from behind me. "Marin?" It was my mother. I turned to face her. Her face was a ruin of pride and regret. The carefully constructed mask she had worn for decades had crumbled, and for the first time, I saw the raw, uncertain person beneath. Can you forgive me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at her, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a cool, dispassionate clarity. I thought of the years of mockery, the casual cruelty, the deep, abiding lack of faith. Forgiveness felt like a language I no longer spoke. It was a currency from a bankrupt emotional economy. "Forgiveness is about feelings," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "This is about work. Forgiveness is a passive act. Work is an active one. Forgiveness is doing the right thing after you've done the wrong one, today." I paused, letting the new terms of our relationship settle in the air between us. We start by simply doing the work. It was not the absolution she wanted, but it was the truth I was offering. It was a path forward, but it was a path paved with effort, not with easy sentiment. She seemed to understand. She simply nodded, a single, jerky motion, and stepped back. From the periphery, a new voice, laced with a desperate, wheedling tone, piped up. "So," Kyle said, stepping forward with a forced, ghastly smile, "now that we're all partners, we should probably discuss my finder's fee and my percentage for bringing this whole corporate strategy to the table." He didn't get to finish. Talia, who had been standing silently by the door, took one step forward. She held up the single sheet of paper my parents had signed, the one with my grandfather's rules. Her finger, tipped with a dark professional nail polish, tapped a single line. "Rule number 4. Kyle," she said, her voice cutting through his entitlement like a shard of glass. "It's the one you whispered to your uncle to sign. Anyone who works this land must actually work this land. There are no silent partners at Fox Hollow." She looked him up and down, her expression one of utter dismissal. "You don't work. You don't get a share. It's that simple. Now, I believe you were just leaving." Kyle's face went from opportunistic to ashen in a heartbeat. He looked at my father for support, but my father wouldn't meet his eyes. He looked at me, but I had already turned away. Defeated, and for the first time in his life, utterly powerless, he turned and slunk out of the boardroom without another word. The hive had expelled its drone. I walked back to the table. The moment of family drama concluded. I gathered the signed documents, the Meadowline Framework Agreement, my grandfather's rules signed by my parents, the civic partnership letter from the town council. I tapped them on the table, straightening their edges until they were perfectly aligned. I held the neat stack in my hand, the pages pressed together, a new foundation. They felt solid, dense, like a freshly built frame of honeycomb, each cell a perfect hexagon, strong and ready to be filled with the future. As I stood there, a sudden, brilliant light filled the room. The sun, beginning its descent, had just cleared the edge of a neighboring skyscraper. A perfect golden ray of late afternoon light streamed through the panoramic window, striking the glass and steel of the cityscape. The entire world outside the window seemed to be lacquered in a sheet of translucent gold. It looked exactly like honey. My work here was done. I began to wheel the observation hive toward the door, my quiet, humming partners ready for their journey home. But before I left, I paused for one last look. I leaned in close to the acrylic, my breath fogging a small patch of the surface. Inside, the life of the hive continued, oblivious to the human drama that had just unfolded around it. The workers moved with their eternal, unwavering purpose, and in the center of the teeming mass, I saw her, the queen. She moved slowly, deliberately, a regal and graceful presence, and wherever she went, a space cleared before her. The other bees parted, turning to face her, creating a living pathway, a moving court of attendants. They didn't do it out of fear. They did it out of instinct, out of a deep, biological certainty. She was the future. She was the center. She was the hive. A small, quiet smile touched my lips, a smile of pure and final understanding. I spoke the last words of this chapter of my life, my voice a whisper, meant only for myself and for the tens of thousands of souls humming gently beside me. This hive has chosen its queen. Fade to black, end. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means the world to me. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let me know what part of the world you're in. Let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up. And to help this story reach more people, please support us by hitting that hype button. Your support helps more than you know.